Good evening. My name is David Branch, Superintendent of the Muskingum Valley Educational Service Center. On behalf of our Educational Service Center, the Ohio Valley ESC, the Athens Meigs ESC, the Jefferson County ESC, and the East Central Ohio ESC, we welcome you here to the program this evening. We know that several of you are watching via a YouTube connection, and we welcome you to the Muskingum Valley ESC. This evening we have a very timely presentation by the Ohio School Boards Association. We have Kyle Lathwell here, and Kyle is going to be presenting on school safety and security. There will be the opportunity for questions for those of you that are watching on YouTube. There is a link to a chat on the right side of your screen. And as such, if you type in a question, we will receive it here and be able to ask that question of Kyle. Again, thank you for your attendance. We're pleased to have you here this evening, and let's get on with the program.
Good evening. Again, my name is Kyle Lathwell. I'm a policy consultant and safety consultant at the Ohio School Boards Association. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk to you about safety and security in schools. As David said, we welcome you to ask any questions that you might have. This can be as much a discussion as you would like it to be. A little background information on me. I come from Lorain, Ohio. I went to Lorain High School. I went on to Kent State University and played basketball there for 4 years. I got a degree in criminal justice and I double majored criminal justice and psychology. I went on to the University of Toledo College of Law, got my law degree there, and moved down to Columbus to practice. I've practiced in a variety of areas. I've done corporate law, I've done education law. I've worked both for the Attorney General's office and the Department of Education. I also went on to do some work in the schools in an autism unit, and I have 2 years also as a law enforcement officer for the Columbus Division of Police. So now I'm at Ohio School Boards Association, so I bring a pretty varied background, and hopefully that will help us here tonight. With that, we're just going to get started with a safety overview and talk about current events. This is not going to be any surprise to anybody. Since the beginning of the year, we've had 20 gun-involved incidents in schools across the country, or thereabouts. I should say just under 20. It's changing every day, unfortunately. As you well know, in Parkland, Florida, there was a school shooting recently. Come on in. We're gaining new guests. On the 14th of February, that shooting took place. As most of you know, it involved a 19-year-old prior student from the school who had been expelled. He actually took an Uber to school, the school, and within about 10 minutes of getting out of the car, he began to open fire. He was armed with an AR-15 rifle. He had a vest. He had multiple magazines in a duffel bag that he was carrying with him. He has admitted to beginning to shoot students as he saw them on school grounds and in hallways, and was on multiple levels of the building and within 3 different classrooms. He was eventually arrested walking down a residential street. He had stopped into Subway. He had stopped into McDonald's. The way he escaped the building was essentially to discard the rifle and the vest and the magazine that he was carrying, and or the magazines that he was carrying, and snuck out with the rest of the students and blended in. At the end of the day, there were 17 dead and more injured. He's been charged with 17 counts of premeditated murder. There were threats and concerning behavior about this young man for years. They've set up to 18 reports of incidents related to him, and on a couple of circumstances, maybe even the FBI was involved and didn't have any follow-up. The other interesting factor in this case was that there was an SRO, a school resource officer on duty, at least one, and he did not go in. There's no explanation that I've heard so far of why he didn't go in, and he has since resigned and retired his position. Some school shooting statistics. Gun Violence Archive was published in the New York Times recently. It's a nonprofit that began tracking school shootings in 2014. And according to that article, there have been more than 400 shot in over 200 school shootings. Another research group stated that between 2013 and 15, there was an average of 2 shootings per month at K through 12 schools. Now, I'm going to switch into bullying statistics too, and it might seem like a strange jump, but bullying is a prevalent problem in our schools, and it can lead to problems both for the individual and for others around them. A 2016 study showed that 1 of every 5, or almost 21%, of students reported being bullied. The most common reasons for bullying reported were physical appearance, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, religion, and sexual orientation. As you can see, most of these things are not things you necessarily can control or not choices. So it's kind of a sad commentary that these are the items that are getting bullied, that kids are getting bullied for most. Not surprisingly, the percentage of cyberbullying has almost doubled from 2007 to 2016. With the onset of electronics and social media, it's easy to do. Speaking for myself, I have 2 young children that are school-aged. I have a hard time getting them off their electronics and off of their social media as well. 74.1, I pulled this stat just because it's so high. 74.1 of the LGBT students were verbally bullied in the past year because of their sexual orientation. That's a huge number. Students who are bullied are at an increased risk for poor school adjustment, sleep difficulties, anxiety, depression, and suicide. An interesting part of one of the studies that I read was about the teacher response to bullying. Students reported that the most harmful things the teacher can do are these 4 things. First, tell the student to solve the problem on their own. The second was to tell the student that it would stop if they acted differently, in essence, blaming the victim. Which again, going back to some of the things that people are getting bullied about, they can't necessarily change some of these things, so how can they possibly act differently about it? The third part is to ignore what's going on, and the last is to tell the student to stop tattling. So while bullying may not seem as important to stop and contain as a school shooting or an active shooter, it is the most prevalent problem in schools among our students. It's been responsible for pushing our children to violence, whether that be violence directed inwardly towards themselves in the case of suicide, or outwardly towards other students and teachers in the case of an active shooter. The best thing that we can be doing in our schools as students and teachers and administrators is stepping in. See something, say something. Even if you don't address the bully. It's, again, something I tell my kids all the time. You don't necessarily have to confront the person doing this, but comfort the victim, talk to the victim, make them feel welcome, make them feel safe. And you never know what kind of difference you can make by stepping in and doing that. You could empower them and, again, make them feel safer. Is everybody familiar with emergency management plans? So I'm going to go through this a little bit, and I've pieced this together and try and make it as interesting as possible, but also get to some points that I think are important. Applicable law for this is Revised Code 3313.536 and Ohio Administrative Code 3301-5-01. There were revisions to the Administrative Code that just became effective in November of 17. In essence, who must have a plan? All of these folks: city exempted village, local joint vocational school districts, community schools, STEM and STEAM schools, college preparatory boarding schools, districts or schools operating a career tech program, ESCs, and preschools or school-age programs licensed by the Ohio Department of Education, which I'm going to refer to as ODE. So who's responsible for developing the plan? Each administrator shall develop and adopt a comprehensive emergency management plan for each building under their control. Administrator means the superintendent, principal, chief administrative officer, or another supervisory authority. and we get into the nitty-gritty. Each comprehensive emergency management plan must consist of 4 parts. The first being the emergency operations plan, which consists of a single document to address all hazards that may negatively impact the school. A hazard identification and risk analysis must also be included. The hazards listed are include but are not limited to active shooter, bomb threat, active terrorism, bullying, and any other natural or man-made event that the administrator knew or should have reasonably known about. As you'll note, bullying is in there, and that is something that came new with the most recent revisions. It's also part of why I put bullying statistics in the presentation today, because it all ties in. The second piece you need for your plan is a floor plan that is unique to each floor of the building, in each building, a site plan that includes all building property and surrounding property, and an emergency contact information sheet. Districts must involve a variety of stakeholders in the development of the plan, and administrators must inform students and parents of the parental notification procedures included in the plan, which you can imagine in the wake of such a terrible shooting in Parkland, how important that piece was, that people were informed and knew what to do in that instance. They must be updated and revised every 3 years, or whenever there's a major modification to a building that requires a change in procedure. So if you've got new buildings going up, if you've got remodels, something that's going to change the structure of your plan, you've got to resubmit. And then prior to July 1 each year, the administrator shall review the plan and certify to ODE that it's current and accurate.
Is the plan public record?
That is what I was coming to. The plan is not a public record. There are I get a lot of questions as a policy consultant about what belongs in policy versus what belongs in the plan. For instance, people will call about a suicide policy. We don't generally have a policy on suicide. It's something that belongs in your emergency management plan. Another big one is arming staff. That question is coming in consistently right now, and that's also something you wouldn't have a policy on because it is a public record, and this is not. So administrators, so there's also the emergency management test. They have to prepare, your administrator has to prepare and conduct at least one annual test. They must meet the following requirements. They have to be a scheduled event, not an actual emergency. So if you have an actual emergency at your school, you can't then count that as your emergency test just because you had to go through the procedures. You have to have something that's actually planned as a test. It can be a tabletop, functional, or full-scale test, each being used once every 3 years. The administrative code defines each one of these specific kinds of tests. It should include at least one hazard from the hazard analysis, so the active shooter, bullying, the things that I just mentioned, terrorism. It should include at least one functional content area, which is the procedures and protocol you're using to address the hazards. And it should include at least one representative from law enforcement, fire, EMA, EMS, or behavioral health. Now, student participation is not mandatory in these tests, but it is allowable. The caveat to that is if you're going to have students involved, you need to have parental permission. And going back, just to reiterate, the emergency management plans are not considered a public record. Therefore, the information within them is protected. And so you got to be careful about placing into policy what actually belongs in your emergency management plan, because the policy manual is a public record. Early intervention. We actually have a workshop coming up on this next week. We're talking about these same things, emergency management plans, early intervention, and de-escalation techniques, which we're going to get to shortly here. I have a couple Columbus police officers coming in to talk about these things because they have to deal with them on a daily basis. So school shootings, as we know, are very high profile, but they don't tell the whole story. In a joint report of the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Justice in 2016, they said that crime and violence in schools has steadily declined, actually, since the late 1990s. And nationwide, that 65% of schools reported an act of violence during the 2013-14 school year, which was actually a decrease. As noted earlier, approximately 21% of all students reported a bullying incident, and it is the greatest, most common challenge teachers and SROs, our school resource officers, face in the schools. We're also contending with mental health issues and the social media impact. Mental health issues, often unidentified or untreated, yet could be contributing heavily to problems in the school for students. There needs to be a greater focus on identifying these students and getting them the help that they need, hopefully earlier rather than later. In social media, the onset of social media, it's a 24/7 thing. They can be on all day, all night. It's not face-to-face, so it's easier for the bullies to get away with what they're saying. It emboldens and protects them. I mean, people go on and create false profiles. It's hard to track down who's doing what. So students can wake up to harassment or bullying after they get up from a good night's sleep and come to school with a sadness in their heart or anger, and it's very difficult for teachers to see that coming or know what it's stemming from. So how can administrators stay informed and aware of what's happening via social media or in their hallways? Again, see something, say something. It applies to everything. If you hear it, don't ignore it. It'll just increase the risk, and that will continue to grow. For instance, yesterday, 2 students at Briggs High School, which is a Columbus school, reported that they overheard a student that he had a gun. They actually took that information and told somebody about it. They eventually got to the kid's backpack. They found 2 shells and a gun, and he has been charged with 2 felonies. So it's a perfect example of the fact that those kids could have just kept walking and thought that he was kidding or just ignored it or didn't want to get involved, but they did the right thing, and something that could have been very bad might have been prevented. So threat assessment. Once you learn of a threat, evaluate both the credibility and immediacy of the threat. Is there a nexus related to the school setting? This is a particularly important piece when you're talking about social media stuff. Is this somehow going to make its way back onto school grounds? Is it a threat that relates to an athletic event? Is it a threat that relates to something that's going to happen at McDonald's later? That's where you got to look and see if you've got a nexus so that as school administrators you know what you can do about it. Is it specific in nature? Is a person named? Is a location named? Is a time set? The more specific the threat, the more serious it's likely to be, and the more quickly you need to take action. So according to the FBI, the research I did on the FBI and profiles, they state that there's no discernible profile of an individual that would predict violent behavior in a school. I guess the interesting thing about this is you can look at some of these incidents where there has been a serious violent act, and you can look and see indicators that maybe you would say, well, this should have predicted that this fella or gal was going to do something. However, you have other students in the same school that have these same indicators that don't ever act. And that's what makes it difficult to decide to predict or profile who's going to actually become an offender. So in this document that was put out in 2002, the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Secret Service worked together to kind of set up a system that related to threat assessment teams, which is a system that school administration in conjunction with law enforcement can use to evaluate threat levels and develop appropriate responses. The goals, of course, are to ensure that students in schools are safe, but also to ensure that students making threats receive appropriate corrective measures to enable them to continue their education. The team members usually include administration, school resource officers or law enforcement, mental health staff, for instance, your counselor, and it may also include parents, teachers, or other school staff. So the threat assessment process. First, you're going to identify the threat, evaluate the seriousness and credibility of the threat. Next piece is intervention. You work with the student to resolve the threat without incident, hopefully. And then follow up to evaluate the effectiveness of your intervention. So essentially you're taking all the steps that you need to alleviate and to stop the threat, to deal with the student involved, and then go back and look at if what you did was helpful, if it worked, what you can do differently. After any incident, it's important to go back and take a look at how things worked and whether there are things that could have been done better. Threat assessment process. The majority of threats are not substantive or immediate and do not necessarily require the attention of the entire team. It may be something that happens in the hallway that an administrator can take care of themselves. If it's a substantive threat and there's credible evidence of impending violence, the entire team must be mobilized immediately. They're going to further evaluate the threat. This kind of setup is the best approach to preventing school violence. It requires a lot of people to work together, and it gives an opportunity for early intervention. How many of you are aware of any threat assessment teams or security risk teams, anything at your districts? Yeah, what do you have?
We have the group that you're...
Something like this? Okay. So de-escalation techniques. This is something that as somebody that worked in the schools and also as somebody that worked on the streets, as a police officer, very, very important to know how to take a situation that's increasing and escalating and neutralize it and bring it back down. It's impossible for an administrator or teachers to know how every student is doing academically, socially, and emotionally. There's too many kids to one administrator or even just to the teachers. As such, it's difficult to predict when a student may have an emotional outburst or become agitated. Verbal de-escalation is a targeted intervention used in these situations. So the stages of escalation, I'm going to go through what they mean quickly, and then I'm going to kind of use an example of pretty much from my experience. There's the stage of being calm. The student is mostly calm and cooperative. Then you have a trigger. The student experiences unresolved conflicts that trigger escalation in behavior. Then you have agitation. The student becomes increasingly unfocused and upset. And then acceleration. As the conflict remains unresolved, the student now focuses on the conflict itself. So an example would be let's say a female student comes into class, is often very quiet when she arrives. You have a question? Okay. Often very quiet when she arrives, and this district kind of knows, the school knows that there's some issues at home. So the teacher has trouble reading day to day how she's doing because she's usually pretty calm and quiet. The trigger, teacher notices she's not participating and asks her to pay attention and keep pace with the class. All of a sudden she becomes mouthy and uncooperative. She was probably already in a bad mood, but was sitting quietly. So the trigger was then the teacher kind of bringing attention to her and asking her to do something she didn't want to do. Agitation. Teacher says that her behavior won't be tolerated and that it needs to improve. So now the student's angry. She wants to be left alone and for the teacher to refocus on the other students. Acceleration. So in this case, teacher asks to speak to the student outside the classroom. Student's anger increases, and it's no longer about what happened at home this morning, but it's about the teacher and the conflict that's going on in that classroom at that time. Her anger increases further. So then you have peak, which is the student is out of control and exhibits the most severe behavior. De-escalation is when they move out of that phase, and then there's recovery, where they often want to disengage completely and are often tired. So in this circumstance, peak would be they're out in the hallway, they're having a conversation, the student is getting increasingly angry. She yells at the teacher, or worse, and takes off running down the hallway. Now the teacher is in a position where she needs to contact administration or somebody else because she can't leave the whole classroom. So administration is notified and intervenes. This is where de-escalation comes in. Hopefully the administrators are able to step in and use some de-escalation techniques that will successfully bring the student back down to a calm level. Recovery, student is given some choices for next steps and, for instance, chooses to rest in the nurse's office or go to the counselor's office and have a conversation. So those are kind of the stages that you can have happen. And you can see that could happen in a variety of different ways. A student can get up and throw a book, flip a chair, cause a fight. There are many, many scenarios. Techniques that would be used by the responding adult. Stay calm, be centered, and be self-assured. Don't panic. Use a normal or softer tone of voice than usual. Even with young kids, I mean, I had a pretty rambunctious little fellow when he was small, and he would get to yelling and screaming, and I would find myself raising my voice as he raised his voice. All that did is cause the situation to escalate and become more and more out of control. So I learned this kind of as a parent. The louder he got, the quieter I got. It works on the street with people that are having difficulty there, and it works in the classroom. Don't take it personal or become defensive. This is not about you. Something's going on with this student. You don't probably have a handle on what that is yet. So if they're yelling at you, it doesn't mean that they're angry with you or that it has anything to do with you. It just means you're the person in front of them at the moment that they're angry. Consider removing other students from the room if possible. So this removes the audience, because on occasion somebody's acting out because they want attention. If you can take the audience away, that helps. Also keeps them safe. In addition, it can protect the student from further embarrassment. So you can resolve the situation. Maybe they'll talk more freely, calm down more quickly if they don't feel like they're being embarrassed by you. One of the tactics that we used on the school I worked with is we would just send everybody on a classroom break, or we'd send all the kids down to the library until we could get control of the classroom again. Also, you need to request assistance from other teachers and administrators. This is where it's important to have a pre-existing plan in dealing with agitated students. Have a team in place which may be aligned with your threat assessment team, and have a plan regarding the communication of this need. Walkie-talkies, cell phones, intercom system. My school that I worked at, we had all of those available to us, but my staff that worked with the unit that I was in, we all kept our cell phones on us at all times. It was understood by the teachers that we were not having personal conversations on those phones, but that we were communicating with each other. And that was our mechanism for getting to another room if we needed to. And the classrooms all had intercoms, so if the teacher needed to get administrators involved, they could use that. But have an idea in place of what you're going to do if you have something go awry. More techniques for the responding adult. Physical presence is important. You want to provide adequate space between the student and yourself. You want a buffer, whether this turns physical or just to give comfort. It's important to have some space in between you so you can move. Display an open and accepting body language. You're not going to stand there with your fists up or looking like you're going to be aggressive. That's just going to escalate the situation. And consider your stance. Standing squared up with somebody puts you kind of in a vulnerable position if it were to turn physical. It's also a little bit more confrontational in terms of body language. So if you put one foot back and just get it a little bit of an angle, you can move more quickly and you don't look as aggressive. So in terms of the way that you talk, what do you say and how do you say it? Use simple, direct language. Somebody that's angry and escalated is not going to understand something very complicated. They're going to be processing a little bit more slowly than they probably usually do. So try and be patient, talk slowly, and use simple language. If they're calm, use a positive yet assertive tone to prompt the student to continue to control their behavior. Encourage them to continue what they're doing if they're heading down the right path. Move towards trying to identify the students' feelings and what they actually need. So try to get to the underlying issue. The faster you can get to the underlying issue, the faster you can do something to solve it. Empathize, but don't excuse the behavior. So you can tell a student that you understand that they're upset and you understand that it's hard to calm down, but you do that in a way that doesn't say, hey, it's okay, anytime you're upset, it's okay for you to act out in class. Once calm, provide options. Go to speak to the counselor, rest in the nurse's office. And when determining discipline, consider all factors. So you know, you may have a student that's got a disability. You may have a manifestation of a disability going on. You can have a terrible home situation that you weren't aware of. I mean, so you just need to take into consideration what's going on with the student, be appropriate and be fair, considering all the factors involved. I mean, is this a student that you have trouble with repeatedly, or is this a first-time situation? Safety and security options. Before turning the page, what do you guys think some of these options are? Or gals, if I have any women out there.
SROs.
SROs. That's right. That'll lead me right into it. The first one I have is the school resource officer. So this is a uniformed commissioned law enforcement officer. When I say SRO, I don't mean private security necessarily. I'm talking actually about a law enforcement officer. Roles of the SRO, they call it a triad. Generally, there's 3 roles within the school environment: that of the law enforcement officer, the informal counselor, and then the educator. So it's a big job. In the law enforcement officer role, the main purpose clearly is to keep the peace in the schools so that students can learn and teachers can teach. It provides an on-site expert for administrators on matters involving safety, even if it comes down to like interrogations, searches, things like that. What needs to trigger law enforcement involvement versus a school discipline issue. Having an officer in uniform may deter criminal behavior or violent behavior. It also reduces the workload of patrol officers because there are less calls going out to them to come to the schools. And in my opinion, if you've got a situation at a school and you've got a resource officer there, the communication is going to be quicker to the department than it would be without them, because they're not likely to panic and forget what they're doing. SROs can also analyze security issues relating to the building grounds, or assist with emergency management plans and staff training. I think it's a great idea to involve your SRO in emergency management plan drafting, and it's also have them in on PD days. Have them in to go over things with staff. Have them look at your staff training as you have it now and suggest improvements. As an informal counselor, they can provide guidance to students and act as a link to support services both outside and inside the school. They can gain trust of students and teachers and improve overall relations between police and the community and schools. They can become a role model that students trust and seek for guidance, which is mutually beneficial. Students understand that somebody cares for them. It's a great way for them to have a respect for law enforcement as they grow older, because some students come to school as very young people and already don't like the police. So if you can have an officer in a school building that has made a good positive impression on these kids, it can go a long way outside of the school building. They can also gain critical information about what's going on in the student population, which could help solve existing problems or prevent future problems. I have a very good friend of mine that's an SRO. He said that he solved all kinds of issues for the patrol officers because he had kids coming and saying things about other folks and houses in the neighborhood and whatnot, and they were confiding in him. It's another example of something where people come and say, hey, so-and-so's been talking about suicide, or it's just an additional person who's not one of the teachers that a student can trust and go to if they need interaction with an adult. In the educator role, they're an additional resource as an instructor. As you know, there's always been DARE programs, which bring in police officers to talk about drugs. They also have specialized knowledge and allow for more thorough instruction in the area of law. They can talk about search and seizure. They can talk about interrogations. They can talk about First Amendment rights. They're going to be familiar with local and national crime trends, the juvenile justice system if children have questions about that. And they can talk about safety threats and appropriate response tactics. When I was in the school, they had the SRO come in and talk about a lockdown and an active, an outside threat and inside threat and what the students were supposed to do. And they heard that right from a law enforcement officer. Collaboration with administrators is a critical component to their success in the school. They need to be informed on school discipline policies and procedures. And everybody needs to know the difference between a criminal issue and a school discipline issue. This is where things get a little fuzzy when the SROs are in the school. Occasionally, all of the matters get shipped to the SRO. And that's not the way that it should be. There are distinct differences between when an SRO should be involved as a law enforcement officer and when it's a discipline issue that should be handled by administration. For instance, be careful with searches. Law enforcement officers must meet a higher standard. They need to meet the standard of probable cause, where your school administrators are going to be looking at reasonable suspicion. So you got to consider that when you're considering a search. The employment arrangement with regard to resource officers usually involves a memorandum of understanding between the district and the law enforcement agency. This is where you get the specific roles, responsibilities, and expectations of your SRO. What roles will the SRO play? Are they going to assist with emergency management plans? Are they going to teach? Are they going to train? Who do they report to? And are we going to have any after-school obligations, like athletic events? That same SRO I was talking about said that he always made it his habit to be the one that was at the athletic events because he was the one in the school. So when those kids that were in trouble or suspended during the day showed up at the game, he saw them coming and just waved them off. Where if you've got either nobody or somebody different, they wouldn't have that background information. It's important to consult your legal counsel when drafting the MOU because this is your main document that sets out expectations, so you want to make sure that you get everything in there and that everything's clear. Door barricades.
Should I wait for the
No.
questions? So like for the SROs, I'm in a relatively small district, and I've got some really sleepy elementary schools, nice quiet little elementary schools. I can't imagine an SRO, finding a lot to do there. That's one of my concerns is how do you keep them, engaged, sharp, focused on things. Do you see them at the elementary school level and in those types of schools? And how large of a school typically would you see an SRO?
Could you guys hear the question? Did I repeat the question? So essentially, how do we keep an SRO engaged at an elementary school level or a somewhat quiet school? What grade level is it most appropriate to engage an SRO? My experience with this is that generally you see them more at middle schools and high schools. The school I was at a middle school, and what they had was a couple SROs who floated the district. So they responded to problems. They weren't housed. I think there was an SRO at the high school all the time, and then there was another one that kind of floated the district, came to the middle school when they were called, and that was their job, to keep moving within the schools. So I think that would make sense because that keeps them busy, but still available if you had a problem.
And then, do SROs have special training that they have to go through to be in a school?
Yes, the question was, do SROs have special training they need to go through to be in a school? There's an Ohio School Resource Officer Association, and there's also a national association. There's nothing in law that says they have to have it, but everybody wants them to have it. So yes, there is a training program that they can go through here in Ohio or at the national level. It's about a 40-hour program.
Okay, so that could be something we could put in an MOU then, saying that
Yes.
we're required to have that type of training.
Yes, which is why the MOU is so important, because you can put in there whatever is going to be important to your district, and that could be one of the things. I mean, the key to an SRO being successful in your school is the relationship and rapport they have with the kids and the administrators and how well they understand their job. I mean, we've seen this go the wrong way in videos and stuff from all around the country, but it goes the right way all the time. It just doesn't get as publicized as much.
Yeah, it's always the exception.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I went to a seminar, not a seminar, but an actual drill. A drill that OSBA was in charge of at Worthington High School.
Uh-huh.
They put you actually in the drill, students and so forth. SWAT teams came in and so forth, and local police came in and all this. Now, the question was asked, the panel, there was an FBI agent there, SWAT, local police chiefs of the area and so forth, of arming teachers. And it was their comment, that kind of surprised me. Their comment was that the only way you should ever arm a teacher is there's 2 technical schools in the state of Ohio, and they should be sent to one of them for a month training. And he says, like, those schools won't do it because, number one, you're going to pay that teacher for a month, and it's expensive to go there. And he said, if you don't do, it was their consensus, if you don't do that, you shouldn't have a teacher armed. And they had a drill with that. They gave one of us a gun. We were supposed to be the teacher. And they told, when we tell you to do something, to drop the gun or something, if a police officer dropped your gun because they think your thing, and was their comment was that they don't know who the teacher is and who's not a teacher because of the way they dress today. If you walk into school, a young teacher looks like he's a student.
Sometimes.
And I said, well, I think to myself, I said, well, anybody got common sense would drop that gun. But what happened was the guy who had the gun and the tactical squad came down the hallway, was saying, please, drop your gun, drop your gun. He turned around with the gun facing police officer, and the officer said, what are you going to do? You shoot him. You kill him. And he said that's one of the main things that we are against arming teachers, because we do not know who they are, and being in the heat of things and so forth, and not thinking properly, because you're not in that situation all the time. He just said he knew he should have dropped the gun, but he just automatically turned around and had that gun there.
Right.
That's what the team said. And I was surprised that in Columbus, they said a SWAT team could be at any school within 5 minutes.
I believe that.
That totally blew my mind.
Response time in Columbus is very fast. There's a lot of officers. I mean, I was an officer. I can't think of a time where I just said, hey, send me another car, where it wasn't within 2 to 3 minutes.
Shocked him with 45 minutes. Get a SWAT squad. I think it's 45 minutes in Orange County to get them to come to the thing.
Yeah.
You could get dog catchers.
5 minutes, I couldn't do it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into Army staff a little bit more here in a minute. Do you have a question?
I'm sorry, guys.
Oh, we can jump ahead. That's fine.
Well, this one goes back to threat assessment. For what just happened down in Florida, that was a former student. So
Correct.
The ability of the school to assess and identify that student as a threat was a lot more limited. However, law enforcement was aware of him on multiple occasions, and there was
Right.
a lot of failures there. But within Ohio, if law enforcement is aware of a particular student who might be a threat, do they have an obligation to inform the district that they believe that a particular student might be a risk to that district?
I don't know the actual legal answer to that, but I would think so. I would think they would want them to know.
Yeah, I think
And
it
this
would
goes
also
into some,
know how well they do that.
yeah, I would be interested in knowing that as well, actually. I'm going to ask my law enforcement friends next week. Let's hop back to door barricades. So this is something that people are talking about a lot as well. Are they effective? What kind of issues do they raise? I haven't heard of a situation where they've been used or not used successfully. So it'll be interesting if people do use them, if it turns out to be a safe a bet for people. So House Bill 64 established the method for door barricades being incorporated into school emergency management plans. This again is something that doesn't belong in your policy but belongs in your plan. Essentially, the Board of Building Standards were required to adopt rules allowing for the use of a device by a staff member of a public or private school that prevents both ingress and egress through a door in a school building for a finite period of time in an emergency situation or an active shooter drill. So there's pretty specific requirements for the use of door barricades. You have to have a safety plan that's been adopted. You can only use it in emergency situations or an active shooter drill. It can only be engaged by staff. Only engaged for a finite period of time. Police and fire have to be notified prior to use, and proof is required. And then in-service training for staff is required, and then records verifying the training need to be maintained. A door barricade can't be permanently mounted onto the door, and removal cannot require more than one operation unless statutory exemptions are met. So this goes to training. You have to be pretty well trained with using these, I would think, in an emergency situation when there's going to be panic, seeing as they can't already be in place. The Americans with Disabilities Act. There's been some talk of the ADA applying with regard to use of these devices, because once they're on, you can't get out. How does that work with the child in a wheelchair, whatnot? The state law may allow use while federal law may prevent it, and there's been very little guidance on this. Again, I haven't heard of a situation where they've been used in an active situation and how that's gone, but I would be curious to hear that. It's wise to consult with legal counsel prior to implementing the use, particularly with that issue. And I don't have any information, you're going to hear me say this again and again, on how many districts around the state might be using them. What I do know is every time I go to anything that's safety oriented, there's always somebody there talking about selling them, promoting them. So, arming staff. So this is one of the options, and many, many school boards are considering this right now. I have received tons of calls about this. They're asking what our position is. They're asking whether it needs to be in the policy, what do they do to get it on, up and running. So the considerations, you do need to have board action by the way of a resolution that authorizes certain qualified individuals who possess the appropriate license, skills, and training to be armed. Possession of a concealed firearm does require a CCW license received through the state, and you need to create training requirements for staff designated to carry the firearm. So, yes.
Say staff, what are you referring to? Bus drivers, cooks, so forth, groundskeepers?
Yeah.
All of them can be on.
Bus drivers, I wouldn't get into that one as much, but
Okay.
yeah. Because then you've got it in a vehicle. But yeah, I mean, you could designate any staff you want. It's really up to the district. It's very much a local control issue. It's a local decision. There are an incredible amount of factors to take into consideration, some of which you mentioned. The one that comes to mind most quickly for me, having been a police officer, is fight or flight. How do you know if this person, how do you know what kind of training they've received or what their experiences are, and whether they're the kind of person that's going to respond favorably in a crisis or not? There's many issues like that. I've heard of people, the argument, well, we're going to put it in a safe at certain locations so that it keeps it away from the students. Well, okay, how are you going to get to the safe? So there's a lot of issues that you need to consider before just jumping in. But again, it's totally a local decision, and everybody's got, response time, as we just mentioned. That's a big factor. In Columbus, officers are going to be coming through the doors in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, whereas someplace else you might be at 15 or 20. So that's certainly a consideration. Yes.
The law does allow any school district in the state of Ohio to establish their own police force.
No.
You can't do that.
No.
Okay.
Back to the board resolution.
Yes.
Does that have to be, is that only a one-time resolution, or does it have to be renewed every few years?
No, just one time.
It's just one time.
Unless you were going to go back the other way.
Okay.
Then you'd want to resolve to
Resolve.
remove it. Yeah. And it doesn't need to be very specific. That it just needs to state that this is what you've decided to do, and that, that's pretty much it. Anything more detailed than that wouldn't be wise. Because again, your policies and board meetings are public, your policies are public. You certainly don't want to be designating who you're going to be carrying in public sector.
Is there any obligation to inform local law enforcement of who might be carrying?
That all is going to tie in with your emergency management plan. Yeah, yeah. You know, and as you said, the whole how people dress and
Yeah.
is the person going to be identified as a teacher carrying or a student or the bad person? Those are all other issues to consider as well.
And
Yes.
one thing that I've been checking into, in all the people that's armed and everything, they have an identification. When that happens, those people put on that identification vest or a collar or a flag or whatever to identify them as the good people. I do know that.
Again, like you can set up your program and training however you see fit, and I mean that's a good suggestion to designate.
I was a cop for 24 years, so I know.
Yeah. Well, I'm not gonna. We'll talk later about how you feel about it. Point of entry systems.
Can I ask
Yeah.
Another question.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So we talked about arming them with lethal weapons. What about non-lethals? Can districts use flashbangs? Can they have a flashbang in their building?
I can't imagine that they can have a flashbang in the building. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on that or comments on that? Yes.
The school district hire anybody do they have to go through the local sheriff's office, local police department to hire somebody to be a resource officer?
Yes. Generally speaking, it's going to be through your local law enforcement. So if
They
it's
have to do that.
no,
They
you can
go
hire.
outside, they can go outside the sheriff or outside the local police.
You can hire a
They
private
bring their
security
own
officer.
in. Okay.
Which actually ties into the search issue, because if you have a private security officer that's just kind of a safety person, a safety consultant, they are an employee of the district versus being an employee of a law enforcement agency. So it's kind of, you get into
Plus, they don't
different,
have to call a law enforcement agency anyway. They
Right.
find something.
yeah,
They have no jurisdiction. They're just a guy in a uniform.
right. So yeah, there's,
Some schools have hired, I talked to, hired people who's in the service,
Mhm.
the military police or something like that.
retired police, military, yeah.
And, they went completely outside the sheriff, which I said, boy, that's risky.
They can.
Because when you want to call them, they say, hey, you didn't help us.
You're exactly
You
right.
get yourself in a lot of
Exactly
Mm-hmm.
right.
problems there.
Yeah, because something that is important in general with all of this is a good relationship with your law enforcement. I mean, you want to know who these people are. You want them to be used to you. It's invaluable to have a relationship. So something like that might cause strain wouldn't be a great idea. Point of entry systems. This is where you have a single point of entry for your school. I mean, the schools my kids have been in, this has already been the case. Back when I was in high school, which was a really long time ago, we had some problems in our town, and they were doing this back then. Now, they didn't have the front doors locked. They had all the other doors locked, but the front doors were wide open, and there was no buzzer system. Now, generally speaking, you have to push a button, announce who you are, why you're there. Generally speaking, there's a camera involved, so they can see the person, and then the staff determines who gets to come in. Now, this is where training comes in. Staff training and communication is critical to the success of this system. Who's controlling the entry? How are they kept informed of individuals who should not be permitted to enter? There was a staff domestic violence shooting not very long ago. I don't remember what state. It wasn't this state. But it was a fella that was known to the staff, so they let him right in. And he came in, he went to his girlfriend's classroom, shot her, a kid got hit. And that, there was a lack of communication there. I mean, there's nothing that says you've got to air all your dirty laundry, but at the same time, if you know that you have a domestic situation and they could possibly show up to the school, it would be a good idea to let the person that's controlling this entry know that. Custody issues. You're going to have non-custodial parents show up sometimes trying to pick up kids. How do you make sure the person that's controlling entry is aware of the things that they need to know? And then what is the protocol if there is a threat to the building? If this person deems that there is a threat, someone's out there that looks like they're carrying a bag that looks like it could contain a gun or is acting erratic. What is your protocol then for handling that situation? What do you do if that person's out? Who's your next in line? So if it's your secretary and they have a sub that day, how do you handle that? Lockdown drills and training. Regular lockdown drills train both staff and students how to handle themselves during a variety of incidents and hazards. Statistically, as you know, it's not likely to be an active shooter. It's more likely to be something else, but knowing how to respond is critical nonetheless. Repetition is important. It creates habit versus panic. I mean, you think about anything that you do, the more that you do it, the more accustomed you are to doing it, the easier it is for you and the less you have to think about it. And that's what we want our teachers and students to be doing. Also with lockdown drills, you want to work with local law enforcement and other emergency responders.
Kyle, one of the things that we're doing here at Muskingum Valley ESC is that the superintendents meet monthly. And every month, or excuse me, every other month, we are having a tabletop exercise after the superintendent's meeting in the afternoon. School district personnel can show up, and the Emergency Management Authority for Muskingum County is leading those tabletop exercises for any of the school districts in any of our counties. So the last month the drill was on, we had a flood, and the school was Dresden Elementary. At that time, the ice was on a river and a jam, and it was a realistic situation. So at that meeting, we picked, okay, what's going to be our topic of the next time? Active shooter. How appropriate for next month's meeting.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
What they really do a good job of posing us scenario questions for which, oops, that's not in the plan. Oops, we better think that through. So we're anxious to hear about what they have planned for us this time.
Yeah, it sounds like a very good idea. In terms of lockdowns, this is just an example of how they can work. I don't know if you're familiar with the recent shooting that was in California. A gunman was on a rampage. He wasn't near the school initially, but he did attempt to make entry into an elementary building. It occurred just as children were being dropped off for school, so right before they went in. Lots of kids on the playground, parents around, which, by the way, I think is one of the most vulnerable times of the day. Drop off, pick up, cafeteria, those are the things that scare me the most. So essentially, my understanding is that actually a secretary heard shots nearby and got out to where the kids were getting dropped off, got everybody in, and instituted a lockdown, which is a perfect example of somebody who's been trained well. Because a lot of times, and I just had a debate with somebody about this, people don't recognize gunshots all the time. They think it's fireworks, they think it's something dropping, they're not sure what it is. And I know that like in police training, it was very important. I mean, it was part of the training so that you got used to the sound of what actual gunfire sounds like. So the fact that somebody recognized that, when it was just nearby and instituted a lockdown is fantastic. The shooter ended up crashing into the school's lock gate with a vehicle and exited the vehicle with a rifle. Tried to make entry into the building, wasn't able to because they were on lockdown, but did end up firing many, many minutes towards the building and into the building, and did hit a child who ended up being okay. But that's a perfect example of good training and how a lockdown can work. Again, staff training, very, very important. How are day-to-day incidents like fights handled? What about injuries or health emergencies? What if a non-custodial parent attempts pickup? What justifies a lockdown? Who decides if the school goes on lockdown, and then who decides to lift it? How are known threats communicated to staff? Whether that even be from law enforcement or among staff. And then who's responsible for training staff on these issues? So lots of questions when it comes to training, and it's the critical piece, that and communication. A lot of training is communication.
So, look, within our district, I know that we also stay really close touch to the districts that border us. So if one of those should go on a lockdown, we respond accordingly as well. Just as a matter of precaution. We also keep in touch with the private schools in the area too. So, and we would let them know if we were to go on a lockdown, and they do likewise with us. We had a bank robbery a couple of years ago in Somerset, and there's a small Catholic school up there, and they went on lockdown and let us know at the same time, so we were able to shut down our school, which was just a couple blocks
And who's responsible for your district getting that message out? Who makes those calls?
It's typically going straight to our district office.
Okay.
And at each school, it's going to be the administrators who
Okay.
decide whether they're going to immediately go or not, then they'll inform. But then the district will communicate with the other districts.
Gotcha. That's a great idea. I think it's a great plan. Safety audits. How many of you guys have heard about safety audits or safety assessments for entire districts? Anybody had one done? Yeah?
Well, done today.
Today?
Because I was concerned and I asked our superintendent, I was actually in her office, and I said, I'm gonna go around someday and just see what doors are open, because we're always, all the doors are locked except for the main door in the front. And she had our maintenance guy go around, check every one of them, and every one of them was secure.
Okay.
And I was just curious about how often they're checked. She says they do that 2 or 3 times a week, just to make sure someone don't have a door propped open or,
Okay.
Because if we can get in it, so can someone else.
Correct. Yes.
What do schools do in which students got to go out to ag rooms, got to go out to the junior high for classes and so forth? It seems to me like a person to stay right outside while those students are coming out, and you can go right in then. Is there a teacher put at those doors that these schools have, or what do they do?
That would
You
be,
know?
again, they could be doing whatever their protocol is and whatever they have in their safety plan. I think that it would be wise if you've got people coming and going. And just like you have, at the school I was at, we had bus duty. There were a certain amount of teachers at bus duty. There were people at the doors in the morning to open the doors. So it's just going to depend on what you've trained your staff to do and what you have in your plans.
That's training the kids too, the students as well.
Yeah.
Because you talk about tailgating, where you go in, you're an authorized person, you go in, somebody just follows
I went
right
to school
behind
and
you.
I went up the
Yeah.
door.
Yep.
Every period,
Yeah.
they're leaving the building to
You
go to a
just
different
walk
building
right
to
through.
take different classes. And I just walk right in.
Yeah.
When they by there tell me not to, or I went to the office, but
Yeah.
Well, and you
just
have parents
carry it
coming
on.
in, like after my kids go to a care after within the school building. Those doors, once they've released for the day, are locked. There's a specific code. You don't call the office anymore. There's actually a keypad, and you put in a code, and that's how you get in. I've seen tons of people just let the person behind them go in because you don't want to be rude.
Correct.
No one wants to be rude. I'm happy to be rude. If I don't know you personally, I'm not letting you in. Like, show me that you know the code. I turned around one time and I said, "What's the code?" And the guy didn't know. And I said, "I can't let you in. I'm sorry." But most people don't do that because it feels like you're being rude to somebody, and that's uncomfortable. Being confrontational is uncomfortable. But that goes to staff training too. I can recall being in the hallway on the second floor of my middle school, and there was a guy that I knew wasn't a teacher. I knew he wasn't a student. And I watched 3 or 4 teachers walk right by him. And I thought, nope, I'm going to go. Who are you? And he pulled his coat back, and he had a visitor badge underneath. But it was another situation where no one was willing to be confrontational. But gosh, that could make all the difference if you've got the wrong person crawling around your halls. So with regard to safety audits, the kind of audit I'm talking about, he's going to tell you, are your buildings safe within your district? What are you basing your opinion on? How do you know they're safe? It's like owning a home. You think your house is in good shape. You think your roof's good, your chimney's in good shape, your basement's not leaking. And then you go to sell your house and you have an inspector come in, and oh my gosh, they come up with a laundry list of things wrong with your house. So this is that kind of audit. How thorough and effective are your emergency management plans? How good is your district's relationship with law enforcement? Are you completing all the drills that you're required to do in your emergency management tests? So one of the things you can consider is having an outside party perform a comprehensive safety audit on the district. Learn where you have weaknesses and you have areas of improvement, because there's always going to be a weakness and there's always going to be room for improvement with regard to school buildings, districts, people across the board. Become informed about best practices regarding school safety and security. So when I think of this, I think of something really comprehensive. I think of reviewing buildings and floor plan, like somebody actually coming in, reviewing all your buildings and floor plans, reviewing your entry protocols for each building, Reviewing your plans for each building, for your actual emergency management plans. Review board policy and see if they're aligned with handbooks. Review your relationship with local law enforcement and emergency responders. Do you have a school resource officer program? Is it in good shape? How's the MOU look? Assessment of camera systems if you have them. Again, sometimes there's cameras, they're not working. So, is the camera systems that you have in place actually working, or do you not have any at all? Bus safety and school transportation issues. How are you handling safety with your buses? It's totally different than your buildings. Staff training methods, how is that going? Use of door barricades, if so, is there training in place if you're using them? And then procedures on arming staff, if applicable. The other thing, then I just mentioned this, the other thing I wrote down for myself is how do you handle arrival, release times, cafeteria, recess. These are kind of what I see as some vulnerable areas. So what do you have in place to make sure that that all goes smoothly and that your kids are protected? So that was just kind of my final thought of something that, food for thought for the districts, that, is there something you can be doing to kind of check how you're doing, take your pulse. So that's me. Anybody have any questions?
One of the things that when I was a district superintendent, we always tried to practice was we wanted scenarios that required not the principal to be the decision maker, but staff members. So like, for example, in most of the phones in the newer schools now, you can make an all call if you know the code from any phone in that building. So if you're clear on one end and you hear gunshots, they may not even hear that on the other end. That teacher, we would walk into their classroom and say, you just heard gunshots, make the all call and call a lockdown right now. All at once they'd be really nervous, fumbling with the keypad. When you put the stress on them.
Yeah.
And then they would get on the phone and this is teacher so
They don't even know where they are.
So you got to practice that stuff,
Correct.
and then debrief.
That's what I was saying about repetition is important, habit
Right.
versus panic. Because, I mean, you can speak to police training. I mean, that's what they do. They put you under the highest level of stress possible to see how you do.
Don't
And
do in real life what you practice.
yeah, right.
Exactly.
And only through repetition do you get good at all that. Columbus's Academy is 6 months long. That's 6 months of, after leaving the force I still said yes ma'am, yes sir to everybody for months and months and months and months because I had to say it every time I spoke in the academy. So.
And whether a district has implemented the ALICE program or not, to answer your question, John, those kids that are coming in, are open targets. And a gunman could walk in right with them. But once that lockdown's called, you need to practice not having staff open up their doors for a kid.
Absolutely.
So what we would do is we would take 2 or 3 kids along with the principal, and then the kid would be banging on the door yelling, let me in, let me in. And the staff, that's hard for a staff member not to do that because that's totally out of their nature.
Yep.
They're very protective. But if the kid has been trained and he sees a gunman off coming down the hallway, he's going to use that E in ALICE and evacuate. So.
Yep. Yep. Anything else? I hope you guys found this helpful. Thanks for having me out here. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you.
All right.
There's plenty of food back here.
Plenty of food in the back.
Did you get any right now, or when you came in, get some now and take it home for the car ride? The next one on